Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another week of Just Gay Stuff podcast. I'm Lauren.
And I am Jess.
I'm actually super excited because this week we have another fabulous guest on our podcast.
Yes, another interview. These are some of our favourite episodes because we get to talk to all different people in the community and outside the community and people that are willing to share their stories with us. And we have someone today that is going to educate us a lot and share her journey. So this week we are so lucky to be joined by Stephanie Saal. She has agreed to come on the podcast to educate us and share with us her journey as someone who is intersex.
Welcome, Steph.
Thank you so much, and thank you both for inviting me on. I'm very excited to just have a bit of a chat about what it means to be intersex.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We first saw your story as part of the ABC segment talking about your life as someone who is intersex. Now, you've probably told your story so many times before then and so many times since, but we are very grateful for you to come on and share your experience with us and our listeners today to help further educate both Lauren and I and everybody who this podcast episode will reach.
Yeah. So would you like to start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and about how you found out that you were born intersex?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a little bit personally about me. I'm someone who loves gardening. I love politics, history. I'm someone who enjoys having a good old chat and just catching up with friends. But in terms of being born intersex, well, that was something that basically started from birth. I typically tend to explain a little bit about how when I was born, my mother and father, they were getting ready for me to come out of the womb, and doctors held me up and they couldn't quite determine what my sex was at birth. So they were thinking that I was going to come out a boy. However, I had some missing parts and they were a little bit unsure about it, and they were about to declare me then a girl, but then they were like, no, not quite either. And what they actually did was they took me away immediately for what's known as karyotype testing, which is where they test the baby's chromosomes to try and determine what the sex is. And then they also did a few other tests as well. But you can imagine that for my parents and for many parents, this is meant to be probably like the best day of their life. You're meant to be able to just hold your newborn, know what the sex is, and then be able to say, this is my child that I'm going to protect and love forever. My parents didn't get that. My mum and dad actually got rushed to a different room in the hospital. They got kind of cordoned off. They had a few family members visit, but not many. And during that time, they just had to wait. And then finally they brought me back in. They got to bathe me for the first time. And then the doctors actually ushered out any essential family members, just had mum and dad in and basically said, your child is born intersex. What that basically means is that we're born with chromosomes of a boy. They have some parts of a girl, but they also have some missing parts as well. What you should do is immediately consent to these invasive surgeries that we will feminize the child. You can raise her as a normal girl. And the best thing is you won't even have to tell anyone about it. You can literally walk out of the hospital in a week's time and no one will ever be asking any questions. They may need to have a few surgeries and be on some hormonal medication later in life, but she will be raised a normal, healthy girl. They didn't actually tell my parents much else. They kind of just gave them a lot of high-level medical information, just designed to kind of overstimulate. And they kind of said a few things that now we know are false within medical research. They said that my unformed testes would become cancerous later in life. They said that psychologically I would develop gender dysphoria to a point of where I probably would want to kill myself if I didn't have these surgeries. We now know that any kind of invasive surgery on a baby at that age can create all kinds of lifetime trauma and stigma, both from a mental and physical well-being sort of standpoint. So basically my parents, they consented to the surgery. They didn't know what else to do. They had never heard of what being intersex was before they became parents. And now they're holding this newborn and being told by these medical authorities that they need to consent to this immediately, or there will be unforeseen consequences. So naturally, of course, any parent will start to move into that mindset of, well, this is how I protect my child, I guess. Fast forward a few years, my mum and dad actually, they did a lot of research. They went to some peer support groups to try and engage a little bit with different doctors and also with other families who had children who were born intersex. And one of the peer support groups kind of helped assist them with this idea of telling me around about 9 to 10 years old about how I was born intersex. So that's how I found out. It's a very long-winded way of explaining that when I was around about 9 years old, mum and dad, they sat me down at the dinner table. They kind of started off by saying, so we just want to let you know that when you were born, there were a few things the doctors said were missing. You were born without a uterus, you were born without ovaries, you kind of a baby later in life. And as a 9-year-old, you kind of think to yourself, oh, well, that's all well and good. I'm not really thinking about baby making at this point, but thanks, mum and dad. I'll definitely note that for later.
Yeah.
And then a year later, we sat down at the dinner table again and they said, so you know how last year we took you through the whole, you can't have a child? There's a little bit more to that. And then they started to go into the details of how when I was born with the chromosomes that were male and female and parts that were male and female. And they explained about I had this surgery to remove the testes. They didn't go into full detail, but I was unaware of the significant consequences around it. And they started explaining about how as I'm starting to develop into a young adult, I'll need to start going on different medications to be able to assist with my endocrine system, because when I was born intersex, there were a couple other little genetic issues that sort of manifested with it. But also I'll need to be going on HRT as my body doesn't produce any estrogen. They also said we would need to be having a discussion around whether I was thinking about being a girl or being a boy. Now, I tell a lot of people this when I tell my story. I am very lucky and very privileged that the sex that was chosen for me at birth is actually the sex and the gender identity that I identify with. And, you know, a lot of people can get a bit mixed up between sex and gender, but I do have that privilege of being able to express myself that way. So naturally, of course, when we came into my early teens, it was a bit of an easier choice for me. But there was still a sense of not being able to fit in much with women, particularly as I was developing into a young woman. I kind of ostracized myself in primary school and high school. I had a small group of friends, but really I just tried to survive day in, day out. But the hardest part about this journey was in 2012, Mum and I went to this new endocrinologist. And for those listening, an endocrinologist is a specialist who helps engage with things such as like the endocrine system. They often do specialize with children who are born with variations of sex characteristics. We went to this endocrinologist who sat down with us and they had some pretty dire news, and they explained to my mother and I that had I not had that surgery at birth, I may have actually had the parts to potentially have a child later in life. So I had essentially become sterilized at birth through a quick decision made by a couple of faceless surgeons. The first 30 minutes of my life and the first few days of my life, I suddenly had lifetime consequences for me. So that's how I basically explained about learning and kind of understanding a little bit more about how I was born intersex.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Do you think that those surgeons at that time thought 100% that that was the best thing they could do for you? Or do you think that was even a rushed decision by them, depending on what they knew at that era, that time?
That's a great question. I think a lot of surgeons, they base it off of old research from, there's a very famous sexologist slash gender researcher called Dr. John Money, who in the 60s, he kind of conducted these kinds of experiments on children who were born intersex or with variations of sex characteristics, feminizing them and then raising them as women or raising them as girls or boys to see what the psychological impacts would be. And a lot of his studies and his research now is based in modern methodology of how these clinicians and surgeons kind of make their decision. I would say that particularly here in the state of Queensland where we're based, we have clinicians that have a higher rate of feminized surgery. So basically children who are born with variations of sex characteristics, the automatic stamp is just to feminize the baby, mainly because it's cost effective to the hospital in ways. And I say this with like the most politest of respect, but it's easier to build a hole than a pole, which means that surgeons are essentially just making cost effective decisions on behalf of the life of a child.
Yeah. I was thinking, as soon as you said that, I was thinking exactly that. It's so much easier to feminize a baby than to do a phalloplasty on a child.
Yeah, that's it.
I'm just like,
it's a lot of
information. Yeah,
it's a lot of information.
Sorry, yes, I always say there's quite a heavy subject with this one. Yes,
yeah.
No, it is.
But it's so much for even us to process, let alone you who has lived through this to process so much about yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. In primary school, some kids did actually find out about me being born intersex. There was a bit of a situation where I was engaging with the doctor and my parents on these email chains. They were sending through these resources of what it means to be born intersex. And they were also sending through some LGBTIQ friendly resources as well, just because they were noticing that there was some tendencies there around identifying as queer even at a young age. And unfortunately, some kids discovered these emails and printed them out and posted them in public places. So naturally, of course, in late primary school, early high school, there was a significant amount of bullying. There were names attributed to me like hermaphrodite, shim, it, she-male, freak. There's just like the list really does go on. And that kind of forced me into a position where I openly rejected this part of me that was being intersex. Mum and dad encouraged me to join a peer support group based here in Brisbane that also is based down in Victoria, run by the amazing Phoebe Hart and also Bonnie Hart. They're two incredible women, but I actually said no. I actively wanted to disengage with that part of myself, so much so that if Mum would bring home any resources for me to read or any potential videos to learn more about being intersex, I said, no, I just want to pretend that this part of me isn't really there and I can just try and live a normal life. And of course I wasn't. I was on certain medications and preparing myself for final gender affirming surgery in 2010. So my life was anything but normal. As well as that, I had to go to hospital once every 6 months for regular checkups for different parts of my endocrine system. So again, there were just these constant reminders. It wasn't until really 2018, 2019 and 2020 that I started to sort of come into my own personal identity and started accepting that this is a part of me. And then once I started processing through the pain of the fact that I had been sterilized at birth by this decision, something clicked in me. It was like a pilot light just turned on and a flame sort of ignited, in which I was like, this just can't happen. This really cannot happen to any other child. I won't deny that, unfortunately, this surgery has created significant mental health issues for myself. I have crippling anxiety. There is a huge fear around anything to do with medical processes, going to a hospital, seeing a doctor, getting a blood test. But there's also significant anxieties that have emerged from this that are almost forms of complex PTSD from this. So for me, the matching of my identity of being an intersex woman is also matching with this passion for the fact that I just don't want to see any child who's born like me end up like me.
Yeah. And I think that's super important, and like you should be incredibly proud of yourself for what you were doing.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Before you were told that you were intersex, did you feel that you were different to any of the other kids at school at all?
I would say yes. So before being 9 years old and being sat down at the dinner table, there was a part of me that seemed to struggle with connecting with other kids my age, particularly other girls. I had a few best friends, from primary school, but in reality, there was a separation. There was almost like a glass wall that existed between me and other women. And that has unfortunately carried right through into adult life, which, I just basically kind of thought to myself, yes, I do feel different for some reason. I don't know why. I want to try and connect, I did typically display in primary school some boyish qualities, some might say even tomboyish.
Mm-hmm.
I preferred Pokemon over Barbie dolls, and I was a little bit more of
Same.
yes, so you get it.
Yeah,
I
get it.
But inherently now I've come to the point where it's like Pokemon, Barbie dolls, they're all just kids' toys, neither has to be for girls or for boys.
Absolutely.
But in that time, you kind of get looked at weirdly by parents in the toy aisle when you're asking for boys' toys instead of girls' toys, or in the playground I was more likely to be playing the rougher sort of sports games rather than, sitting on the bench and just talking with the girls. So there was, looking back particularly, hindsight is 2020, you can start to identify these little flags that were sort of popping up.
Yeah. 9 years old to 11 years old is such a young age to be told that you wouldn't develop in the same way as other girls in your class. Was that something that you kind of understood?
A little bit. I think it actually just affirmed the fact that I'd been feeling so different. But once the horse race had begun, I started to notice it even more in ways that probably made me feel even more isolated. For example, girls typically when they are, in that development teen phase, they talk about breast development. It's a very common conversation that occurs. When did you start your first period? I actively removed myself from those conversations because girls would start talking about it and I would be like, oh yeah, sure, same, and then would just distance myself or disassociate from the conversation, because the truth is I wasn't getting any of that. There was no estrogen in my body to be able to start that development. I had to start taking that myself, and we knew that the effects of that would be lesser and also take longer too. So there was a little bit of this, unfortunately, again, with the bullying of being flat-chested, there was a lot of stigma and personal anger around that as well. Like, why can't I have a woman's body? Why can't I be like one of these other girls who are all developing at a normal rate? But yeah, it started to spark up even further, particularly from grade 7 through to grade 11. That was definitely like the hardest years of not feeling like I felt like I was a girl, but I felt like I wasn't a proper girl.
And high school is such a tormented place in general.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it really is survival of the fittest, just trying to get through each and every day.
Yeah. Looking back now, you spoke a little bit about some of the flags that had popped up. Do you feel like you would have benefited from knowing earlier or later than when you were told at 9 years old?
I feel like 9 years old is actually that's a really good age to kind of start these conversations. But I will say there is no guidebook to being a parent. There's especially no online guide to being a parent of a child born with variations of sex characteristics. A lot of parents who have this issue, they have a lack of resources, they have a lack of psychosocial support, and then they basically have to just fumble their way through the first 20 years of life, making sure that they don't ruin the psychology of their child. So I think 9 years old was great for me. I don't know if any earlier I would have been able to have completely understood. But hindsight, looking back then, this is a very, very specific moment. I remember quite a few years ago, I think I was in grade 4 or grade 5, I received for Christmas one of these electronic journals, the one where you need like to say your password.
Yeah.
Total gimmick, bit kitsch, but I absolutely loved it.
Oh, they were the best.
Yeah, they really were. But I remember writing in there about the fact that I am a girl. I remember writing about the fact that I liked girly things, I liked dresses, and whilst I may not have been a big fan of the colour pink, I looked at the mirror. I don't know why specifically I was writing it. I think it was because, again, there was channeling a lot of these feelings around being isolated, and that again was in grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, one of those typical years. So I do think we actually probably don't give children enough credit for the fact that they can conceptualize the idea of their gender identity probably much earlier in life than what we think.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the big decisions around choosing sex, choosing gender identity, I think those things, that was a good time for me at 9 to 10 years old, leading into 12, 13, 14, which is what research recommends as the actual years for a teenager to start trying to understand and start making those decisions around, well, I wish to identify and have my sex be male, or I wish for my sex to be female.
After enduring the bullying and the name calling and the isolation growing up, what gave you the confidence to share your story? Was it just that you didn't want other kids to endure the same things you did, or was there something else there as well?
It's so clear in my mind exactly what it is, and it's finding your tribe. And I think I speak for a lot of queer people who are probably listening into this tonight, in that we are given a very precious gift in this lifetime of where we get to choose our family, we get to choose our tribe, because unfortunately our blood kin, our relatives, they don't always have the ability to understand, or perhaps they come to understand much later in life as we're growing up. For me, a few years ago, I found a group of amazing people, and, shout out to Chris Moore and Luke Moore, two amazing, brilliant men who listened to my story the very first time. I don't know why, I felt very comfortable talking to them about it. And they, instead of giving a bit of like, oh, this is a bit weird, or this is very heavy, they met it with just some unconditional love. And I think that is something that once you find that, once you see a glimmer of that in the world and you think to yourself, this actually exists, it suddenly brings a spark out of you to be able to be like, okay, this actually is who I am. It can be unconditionally loved. It can be loved with no strings attached whatsoever. I do want to speak more about it, and maybe perhaps not even speak about it, just be able to own it and just be able to show it a little bit more. So there's a good group of us, my little tribe, my little chosen family, I like to call it sometimes, of people who are just, I absolutely adore, and I know they adore me too.
Love that.
Yeah. honestly, finding your tribe is one of the best things you can do in life. And we say on this podcast all the time, if you've yet to find your tribe and are experiencing
We're
difficulties, well, yes, we're here. But if you're experiencing difficulties with family or the current friendships, you have the ability to pack up all your shit and go and find a place where you will be accepted, because those places are out there and you will be accepted, and there is a light at the end of the tunnel and it's waiting for you.
Yeah.
100%.
Do you think more stories like your own and more people being educated on the differences that we all share could prevent the bullying and isolation that you endured?
I definitely think education is a big part of this, what we don't know, we tend to be afraid of. So once someone speaks their story, and I'll recall last year, actually, I was in this art fashion show, and a friend of mine who's a brilliant designer, Bella Cameron, she created this piece around my intersex story and also combined it with her story of being a non-binary queer woman. And there were a couple of women at the show who asked about this. And, I spoke quite honestly about my intersex experience. And at first they were a little bit uncertain. I think they were perhaps perceiving that I was choosing my sex on a daily basis. And I said, no, this is something I was born with. And I went through and I took them through the actual story, and they were mothers. So they naturally just gravitated around the piece, around the fact that my own mother didn't get to hold me. And that when I told them about the fact that this decision had grave consequences for the rest of my life, not being able to have a child, they were instantly clicking onto the fact that this should never have happened. So I'm a big believer that education is really the first major step to bringing people along with the journey. And, you got to sell it, not shout it. You got to be able to sort of lead people along and be ready for some hard-hitting questions too, particularly when it's something so heavy around like queer identities or queer acceptance. Those are really heavy topics. So I had to be willing to walk through a little bit of pain to try and get there. But by the end of it, particularly with those lovely women, once they had heard the full story, they were instantly on board. They were just asking more about our story, about how we identified, about, all sorts of things that kind of made them go from, we're not too sure about this, probably going to leave it alone, to we want to know everything we can about what it means to be a hermaphrodite and how we can support those who are born with variations of sex characteristics.
How special is that for you to have changed their lives in that moment, for them to then carry that education to the next person that they could speak to that might be a bit unsure. And then now you've given them that education to spread, because being under the queer umbrella, even though it gets tiring, we do have this duty to continue to educate those around us. And I think it's really special that when you pass on information to someone who was a bit unsure in the first place, for them to leave your conversation or leave your space really positive and really gung-ho and ready to tell the next person. I feel like that's such a special thing we can do as humans, is spread that love and spread that positivity and guide people on a positive path instead of a path of uncertainty.
I fully agree. There was something special about that night in particular. And there's been several colleagues at work who have seen the ABC special, and I've been able to answer their questions, at work, and be able to take them along on that journey as well. To me, what it makes me think of is the next time someone who's born with variations of sex characteristics comes up to that person and says, well, I was born, with parts that couldn't be identified, they then get to be like, I know and sympathize with your struggle. And then they can actually just already have that peace in their mind. And I think there's a level of acceptance that gets built from that. That future intersex person who's coming out to explain their story can actually be quite comfortable in the fact that you've heard about what it means to be intersex before. You understand that there are different variations of it across a wide spectrum of different issues. And you can also have a bit of empathy for me around the fact that I have these certain struggles as well. It just, it makes the world a little bit kinder, which is something we've really all got to be striving for, particularly at the moment.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. You kind of a little bit just answered this next question then, but how important is it for you to tell your story and break the stigma and shame around intersex people?
I am a personal believer that there is nothing more powerful than our stories. We human beings, we are natural orators at heart. We have this almost genetic ability to speak about our suffering and our pain, but also our hopes as well. So there is definitely a part of me that says that I absolutely have to share this story with anyone who's willing to listen.
Do you feel like as you've gotten older and as you speak to people that have been more exposed to, I suppose, people that do identify under the queer umbrella, do you find that those people have been more accepting than maybe some of the brick walls and barricades you've come up against in the past?
Absolutely. I think for LGBTIQ people, or LGBTQA, as I try and say that so fast, we have shared traumas. We have shared hopes and dreams as well. You know, people who are transgender or gay or lesbian, bisexual, we're seeking a normal life. We're seeking a life of acceptance and just being able to live and find love and find family. So when I share my story with people in the LGBTIQ community, there is definitely a sense of acceptance and a sense of identifying. It's like, I stand in solidarity with that because I am also trying to find that in my life as well.
Yeah. What do you think are some of the biggest myths and misconceptions surrounding being intersex that attributes to less acceptance and less understanding?
Oh, I love this. Well, I hope you guys are history nerds like I am, because I like talking a little bit about like the Greek mythology of how hermaphrodites kind of came to be. But a lot of the idea of intersex people comes from this sort of stigma of like, oh, so they must have a penis and a vagina. And, you know, that's kind of like the physical anatomy of a hermaphrodite. And that actually stems from the ancient Greek mythology of Hermaphroditus, the son of Hermes, and this naiad called Salamis. And they basically, you know, merge together in this spring water after one of them prayed to Aphrodite and, you know, have the parts of a woman and the parts of a man. That is obviously one of those kinds of images that spark immediately when people think of intersex, and obviously that's just not true. There's over 40 to 50 different types of medical variations of intersex, and some of those do range from, you know, micropenis and being born without a uterus or ovaries, right through to with what I had, which was being born with internal testes. So it's varied, it's unique, it's brilliant. I say intersex people are the best because we carry a level of genetic diversity that's never really seen before. The other one that I think is a myth, and I hope one day to be proven right on, is current statistics say to us that 1.7% of the population of the world has variations of sex characteristics. I probably believe that that's actually significantly quite higher. I won't put a number to it. I'm certainly no data or mathematician expert, but what we can understand is that if you take into account genetic, physiological, chromosomal, and also those kinds of different variations, I do believe that that population is significantly higher.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, because on a spectrum, when we're talking about variations of sex characteristics, not everything looks the same, and some people might chromosomally be different to how they are with their gender identity and stuff like that. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong, but
yeah, no, that's
okay. Thinking along the lines of not everything is as visible as we think, and like not everything is as visible to ourselves as we think. So unless we're getting specific testing done on specific people or on everybody, we're never going to know who is varying and who is not.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And the struggle as well that we're finding, particularly with data that comes from hospitals, is prior to recent legislative changes, particularly in the ACT, some hospitals were actually just covering up the fact that people were born intersex. You know, they would just glide them through the conveyor belt of non-consensual surgery, push them through into that, and then out they come the other end, and they just basically wipe the slate clean in terms of birth data. We have seen that historically across several different medical institutions. So there are opportunities in the near future. I am definitely advocating for the fact that Census 2026 needs to include a question around measuring people with variations of sex characteristics. That's an ongoing discussion at the moment, but we definitely need that data sooner rather than later. One, because we want to know how many people in Australia have variations of sex characteristics, and two, because we believe that those services that intersex people need access to, specific psychosocial services, deserve that kind of funding, and it just doesn't come unless we get the data first.
Absolutely. And that leads us into the next question perfectly.
Yeah. So something really important that you're doing is you've launched a campaign to help protect intersex children in Queensland. What does that campaign involve?
I'm very, very happy to announce that about a month ago, we launched the Their Body, Their Choice campaign. What it's really focusing on is two different areas. One, introducing similar legislation to that as passed in ACT a little while ago, which criminalises surgeries on newborns with variations of sex characteristics. It also looks at updating clinical language around intersex children, making sure that they are well and truly protected under the Anti-Discrimination Act. The other, I suppose, facet of that as well is ensuring that parents have access to adequate resources to be able to sort of learn a bit more about what it means to have an intersex child and be able to know more about the consequences of these surgeries as well. Because that's another big part of the conversation too, is ensuring that parents be able to know what is being put forward on the table for them. And the fact of the matter is that I believe there's only a single web page on Queensland Health website right now about intersex. It doesn't contain that much. It certainly doesn't talk about what happens with your child with surgery. So we have a lot of work to do there, and that's kind of where that campaign has come from. In terms of if anyone would like to help out with that, this is a grassroots-based campaign. It's people power first, and it's certainly going to be people power that enacts legislative change in Parliament. I'm happy to plug a website if anyone would be.
Go plug away.
I've never done this before, but it's www.protectintersexchildren.com. Basically, that is just a website that contains a petition, and you just can hop on there, have a little bit more of a read about my story, and also sign the petition to be able to get to know a little bit more about the campaign. But I can encourage anyone, particularly those who maybe are listening who are also born intersex, this is a good time for us to collectively work together to share our stories, not just in community, but also between ourselves, and to start organising for real change.
Is there another way for any of the listeners besides the petition to be able to help make your campaign successful?
Absolutely. I mean, writing into your local member also is a really great way, particularly writing in asking what the current plan is for a review of the health system around intersex surgeries. That's another great way to be able to build and get the knowledge on what our new state government is planning. The truth is, and looking ahead here, I don't think that they have any plans for changing that. They certainly don't have any plans for listening to queer people here in Queensland. So, write in, call into your local member as well, but also following IRA, the Intersex Human Rights Australia. They are a fantastic leading peak body for intersex knowledge and resources. And then also following IPSA, that's Intersex Peer Support Australia. So those are two really good peak bodies to follow as well.
Awesome. We will put all of those things in the show notes if anybody wants to click on the links after listening to this episode. That way we can have all that information direct to everyone who's listening. And if they want to follow up things with the petition, if you want to sign the petition, we'll put everything in the show notes.
Yeah, everything in the show notes. I was like, you literally took the words out of my mouth. Yeah. I went to speak and you got there first.
That's usually what happens here.
Yeah.
You guys have got that hive mind going.
We do. You know what they say? Like in lesbian couples, you just merge into one person. It's like slowly happening.
We mentioned in the beginning that you shared your story through the ABC piece, and in our correspondence you noted that it was specifically targeted at educating a straight audience, but there also needs to be a lot of education in the LGBTQ, I can't even say it, however you said it.
Has a little bit of a French.
It's French, yeah. LGBTQ community as well. Do you think there is more understanding from certain social groups, or do you think that education is lacking completely across the board?
I think there is still some work to be done. I won't say it's lacking, but I will say that intersex people probably haven't had their time yet to be able to really explain their story. In our own circles, in our own peer support groups, we all know our stories very, very well. But once we start talking to the acronym outside of I, people start to get a little bit confused between the many different letters of that queer alphabet. So I think there is a bit more work to be done, but there has been so many great opportunities already over the past few years where we've been able to speak at Brisbane Pride. I recently went up to Townsville to speak with a group of queer people up there I was able to share my story a little bit about being born intersex. And, we had a few people up there who said they knew family members who were born intersex. So I think there are a lot of opportunities, but the best thing is the LGBTIQ community, they're the ones who are listening. They are the greatest allies that as intersex people we can and should be relying on at the moment. Because again, like I spoke before, we have that shared trauma. Yeah. I mean, all you have to do is speak to someone. Whilst it's not the similar journey, particularly the same process of getting from, A to B as a woman or as a man or as a non-binary person, we have shared trauma and struggles around identification, around acceptance, around medications, navigating the health system, particularly a health system that has been constructed to already keep queer people silent or ostracized from mainstream medicine. So that there already shows that it's not what divides us, but what unites us. So whilst, we're educating and bringing our story out there, they're the ones who are definitely listening the most.
We've touched on the medical side of things and the general no knowledge about intersex people. But another thing that I was just thinking of then is common visibility to normalize intersex people. There is zero visibility of intersex people in mainstream media. So how do you think that would change things for a lot of intersex people?
Oh, God, I reckon any type of visibility we know has a positive effect, particularly on younger people. I believe I have only ever seen one TV show in my life that has covered a little bit of intersex, and I believe that was an episode of Call the Midwife, in which a woman who was in her late 40s presented to the doctor complaining about stomach cramps, and the doctor did a whole bunch of scans and tests, and obviously this is in the UK in the 50s or 60s. I always forget what time period that is. And then they come back to her and say, you have testes in your body that you were born with, but obviously no one told you about that, particularly when you were born. That was one episode. I also know that there is a movie out that covers an intersex person. However, it kind of blurs the lines between like the journey of a trans person and the journey of an intersex person. So again, that kind of visibility in mainstream media is something that needs to be seen sooner rather than later.
Have you ever thought of throwing your hat in the ring to create a story of your own to throw into mainstream media?
Oh, God. I mean, there's a part of me, as a kid, I loved filming movies, right? I used to grab my mum's old Motorola, the pink flip phone. And
we all had one.
Yeah, we all did it. And we all, like, the camera on that was the best of the time. So I can remember trying to make movies with that one. And whilst I do have a flair for the dramatics as a thespian, I'm sure there are plenty others out there who are skilled actors and actresses who can most definitely fill that role. But hey, if someone ever comes a knocking and says, would you be keen to film something? I'm always happy to just put my hand up, just share it.
You never know what's coming.
You never know. That's exactly. You should never say never, particularly when it comes to show business, I suppose.
Absolutely.
That's true. We're talking about representation. As a kid growing up, what do you wish you had, or something that you think could change the lives of intersex kids now?
There are two things in particular. I'll go with the lighter one first. Education in the school system around being intersex. I feel like I never took biology. I wasn't really a science kid. I was more someone who enjoyed reading and writing and arts and crafts, But, hands up from anyone who's watching or listening for that. But I do know that even in biology, particularly in grade 8, grade 9, they didn't really in my school cover intersex. They covered male chromosomes and female chromosomes. I believe they briefly mentioned that there's a little bit of grey space, but then nothing else after that. They certainly didn't cover any of that in ethics or civility or religious studies around, man, woman, whatever else. I did go to a religious school, so, perhaps there's a little bit of top cover from teachers there to just be like, we're not going to bother teaching this kind of complex sort of issue. But as a kid, I think that would have just perhaps reassured me a little bit that what I was is okay to talk about, that I wasn't some freak or some mythological monster that needs to pretend to be like a normal kid so that no one finds out who I am. You always see those like fantasy movies where the kid who's got some sort of monstrous attribute, finds it kind of cool to keep it secret or hidden. It really wasn't. It was tough, to try and tell yourself every single day in the mirror, I'm a normal woman, I'm a normal girl. I can just get through this next day of school knowing that. The other thing as well, because I grew up as an only child, so my parents didn't have any more kids after me. It would have been nice to have had a sibling as well, not even one who was born intersex, just another sibling to be able to get through the day with, perhaps to be able to talk about my own fears. I could always see myself being an amazing older sister. But yeah, that was just one of those things where, again, having a sibling means that, yes, at school you may feel isolated, but as soon as you get home, there's someone there who may, annoy the shit out of you, but at least they're your kin, they're your blood, and there's a level of understanding there that goes beyond what normal friendship could be. So those were kind of the two things I feel like, looking back, had I had those, perhaps I would have felt a little less lonely and a little less isolated.
And I'm sure now your advocacy for intersex children makes you be that big sister to them in general.
Yeah.
It does give a little bit of that sometimes. I've met a few intersex people. Last year at Brisbane Pride, this one guy came up and I was talking about being intersex. He's like, I was born intersex too. I didn't really know too much about it, and I just gave him the biggest hug. And I was just like, mate, you are just so loved. You're going to be okay. I understand about the fact that these surgeries have kind of made us feel like perhaps at one point we were imperfect and now we have to try and be these perfect human beings, but we don't have to. And we just had a little bit of a cry about it, actually. It was a really emotional moment. It was really the first time I did actually meet someone publicly talking about our intersex traits. But it did feel a little bit like a big sister moment.
I think in general, there's no greater comfort than having someone come to you and say, I know how you feel, or I've been there before, or I can sympathize with your emotions. And I guess that's kind of what you were saying with having a sibling. They're in your corner whether they want to be or not because they're blood-related family.
They've got no choice on this matter. Once you're born kin, that's it for life.
Yeah.
No matter how big the feud.
Yeah, totally. And I know that can be problematic for some families, but in general, I think, or I hope that it's yeah. What I wanted to ask was, were there things that you felt like you couldn't express to your parents that you were feeling because you didn't want to worry them or you didn't want to make them feel guilty for any of the choices they made?
I actually didn't tell my parents much of anything about high school, about the bullying. The only thing they really knew about was when we go to these hospital trips, I'd go get blood tests or we'd go visit the endocrinologist at the Children's Mater Hospital. We would leave the hospital after an appointment with me in tears because I was always being given some new news about Stephanie needs to go and take these medications. Stephanie needs to go and get these injections. Stephanie needs to go and get a Synthac test, which is basically, they test your cortisol levels, and obviously I had a huge fear of hospitals, in particular needles. So my parents only really saw that side of me, the side of being afraid of hospitals and medical situations. But when it came to the bullying and when it came to the personal identity and the loneliness, I didn't share any of that with them. And I don't think it was out of I didn't want them to feel guilty. I think it was more just out of the fact that I just didn't know how to express to them my feelings, partly because acknowledgement of feelings means acknowledging the reality, which is something perhaps as a teenager we just don't really want to do. We would much rather think, if I think hard enough or if I block it out hard enough, then it really truly won't exist. The problem is that it's there waiting for us 5, 10, 20 years later, no matter how hard we try and block it out. So it was only recently in the past few years that I actually spoke to my parents and I told them a little bit more about how I was feeling and the struggle that I had gone through, and they were shocked. They were like, you had masked through that entire period. They knew a little bit of the bullying, but they certainly didn't know to the extent of what it actually was. And I would say that was probably one of my biggest mistakes of not openly sharing. But again, I'd been taught from basically birth, hide away these parts of yourself, keep it all secretive, remain a fortress of solitude and just try and get through. And I can safely say, as someone who did that for 25, 26 years, it does not serve you well in the end. It only causes more damage and it creates a future barrier for you for creating beautiful connections with beautiful people.
I'm so glad that even though you weathered the storm alone, that you are still around and you're still here to share your story, because I know that things can get so dark and so tough when we feel like we can't share anything with anybody in fear of rejection, in fear of all of these things.
Yes.
So I'm so glad that you can look back and think, oh, I should have, but you're still here to say that. So that's great.
I'm grateful too, honestly, and again, hindsight is 2020. And I think speaking on my parents, I won't try and speak to their personal story, but I do know, and particularly, my mum's been talking with me a little bit and she's been very open about this. There is a certain level of shame that she's had to work through of having a child that was born intersex, and this comes from society's programming of what a perfect child is, you listen to any medical TV drama, when they're pulling a baby out from the womb, the first thing the doctor says is, it's a boy, it's a girl, and they say it with such fanfare, it's the best announcement in the world. But when you get told it's we don't actually know what it is, I think parents can carry a little bit of that personal shame, but that's their own thing to kind of work through. And I do think, I've encouraged my parents to be able to move through that and try and find ways to heal through that.
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, there's no fault there. You can't control these things. It's the same. Your parents couldn't control that part of their lives the same way that you couldn't control that part of your life. And so I think that's where we're talking about normalizing the differences that each of us have. I think you said it in your ABC interview. It's like an oxymoron. We're all so different that we're the same.
Yeah.
Normal is different or different is normal. It's such a paradox. And it's really interesting, actually. So I've had quite a few people online, and also, yes, there were a few people in person who have recognized me from the ABC special who have literally come up and said, different is normal. We love that line. Or the other one that they've said is, I pick me. So some people have actually like kind of made that a bit of their mantra, which is so cool. I honestly, I love that. But that particular paradox of saying different is normal is something that can kind of get people to think a little bit. They have to go like, well, what does that actually mean? Oh, that does actually mean, yes, everyone is different. Everyone is genetically unique in their own way. Some people just have uniqueness on the outside and some people have it on the inside.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think we all forget that if we were all the same living on this earth, it would be manic. Like if we weren't different to each other, it would be more manic than it is now.
Oh, he's so boring.
So boring.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Steph, for joining us and helping spread so much education around the subject. I have to admit, before I saw your piece on ABC, I didn't realize how little that I knew and how we all needed so much more education on the subject.
Yeah.
So before we do sign off, after having your story shared across such large platforms, what is one of the most positive responses that you've had, besides what you just said, that people have come up and used your own lines on you?
I think the positive response has just been, you deserve to be loved. I think that's been very affirming, and it's kind of helped me accept the fact that, yeah, I started reaching this conclusion a few years ago that, yes, I actually do deserve to be loved. I deserve to be looked at as just someone who was, yes, born a little bit different, but that doesn't make me any lesser or any more of a freak or anything. So you should never really do this, but I did take a scroll through the YouTube comments once, just
Brave.
To have a look at the ABC video.
Yeah, brave.
Bit of a prayer. I was saying, oh gosh, please, let's see what happens here. And I was pleasantly surprised to see how many people were just saying, you're beautiful, you're amazing, like you just deserve so much love for what you've been through. But I hope people don't stop there at that. I really hope people then take that into there needs to be change, because, you know, whilst it's good that I'm able to share my story and be able to do that, action needs to be taken now. That's kind of like the next step. And a lot of people, again, that's also been very affirming to hear people say, what do we do now? We've heard your story. We've looked at other people's videos around being born intersex. What do we do and where do we go from here? So that excites me. That makes me think that we can enact real change.
Well, we're going to put all those links and the website that you told us about into the show notes. So everybody who is listening, if you would like to help further intersex kids have a normalized life and be safe away from such medical procedures like Steph has described, we will funnel you into that petition and you can sign off on that to let's make some positive change together.
Like Steph said, action is the next step. So here we go.
Yep. Let's all band together and get it done. I do want to just say a massive thank you to you as well.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And I think the whole fact that you are sharing such a raw and emotional part of yourself in order to bring people together that either are intersex or know people who are intersex, or you're giving them a sense of knowing someone who is intersex, is already positive change. And so thank you so much.
Thank you so much for jumping on.
Can I just say as well, thank you both to you for not just for inviting me on the show, but I think I spoke previously about the fact that we need more queer media, particularly on a local grassroots level. So being able to come on here and speak is fantastic, but being able to see that Just Gay Stuff is really starting to take off, particularly in this corner of the world, that makes me really happy. Makes me think that there's a bright future ahead for us as queer people to share our stories and get organised as well. So thank you for the work that you guys are doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you everybody for joining us this week on Just Gay Stuff. We love sharing stories like Steph's. It is so important for everybody to band together. We know that storytelling is literally a gateway to education and creating empathy amongst ourselves. When you know somebody who has gone through the weather alone, you now know how to help protect further people that are going to endure the same storm, or you can help those people that have gone through the storm alone. So thank you again, Steph, for being so
thank you.
raw, so open. I know
Thank
that
you.
some parts of your story would have still been so emotional for you to talk about. So thank you for being that open and raw person with us.
And I know that we definitely got some education out of it, and I'm sure our listeners did
Some,
too.
I think I got lots.
Yeah, lots.
And I hope that everybody else did as well.
Yeah.
Well, until next week.
You better remember to.
Stay gay, motherfuckers.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steph.
Thank you. Cheers,
I'm
guys.
talking about, you're talking about, we're talking about just gay stuff.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Just Gay Stuff. Make sure to follow us at Just Gay Stuff Podcast on all your socials and write to us with your stories at justgaystuffpodcast@gmail.com.